Hi everyone, my name is Professor Dominic Bryan, and I'm the disciplinary lead in anthropology in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University. What I intend to do over the next few minutes is to explain a little bit about anthropology, because there'll be some people who haven't come across it before or who are interested in taking it up for the first time. So I'm going to explain a little bit about anthropology, a little bit about what it's like to be at Queen's University, and what members of staff in anthropology do and what you might expect. So first of all, we'll talk a little bit about Queen's University. Anthropology has been taught at Queen's since the early 1970s, and Queen's University is a member of the Russell Group. That's the top 24 research intensive universities. I'll be coming back to phrases like research intensity a little bit later in the presentation. We're ranked in the top 250 universities, and in the top 140 in the world for graduate prospects. And something else which many of you will be interested in, I suspect, is what it's like to be in Belfast. And what I can tell you is that we have some of the lowest rents in the country. And I'll mention a little bit about Belfast later. It's a place that I'm not a native of Belfast, as you can tell from my accent, but I've lived here for about 30 years. I'm very, very fond of the very fond of the city. Queen's has put in enormous investment over the last few years around its buildings. There you've got some nice pictures, and I have to say, as someone who's been on the campus for 20 years, it's been amazing to see it develop. And some of the wonderful buildings that we've got, I think you've got computer science there in the top left, our great library in the bottom left, and then the two pictures on the right hand side are broadly the area. Anthropology, the department, is in those houses you can see in that bottom right hand picture. On the left there is the graduate school, and on the right is where all the teaching, it's the law school, and where much of the teaching takes place when you're in at Queen's University, when we're not in a COVID pandemic. So let me tell you a little bit about anthropology. You'll get some of the, I'm constantly amazed at how amazing my colleagues are at Queen's University. You get some of the most thoughtful, forward-looking members of staff teaching you that you could possibly wish for. The dynamism in our place is incredible. And we really have some of the best world-leading experts in anthropology, with experience from all around the world. I'm looking at those smiling faces of my colleagues there, and at the top, two Fionas at the top have experience both of research in Australia and Ireland, particularly in Australia. Both of them have looked at various aspects of Indigenous peoples and their life and difficulties in Australia. We have people who work on the whole area of cognition and culture, which I'll come to fairly shortly. We have an expert, Mariska, who is an expert on art and material objects and their dynamics in the spaces and places, what they mean for people's identities. We have people working on ethnomusicology. We have people working on migration. I'll come to some of those issues later, but I can promise you a really good experience when you come to Queen's. We've also had successes in a number of areas, which I'll talk about, particularly around policy areas that our research works on. And I can guarantee you that you'll enjoy. You get to know the staff well when you're at Queen's, and I think that's very important when you're going to a university. All right, so here's the thing. What is anthropology? It's in some ways I'm quite bitter about this subject, because I think anthropology, or social anthropology, as the area we teaches is called, is at the center of what it is to be a human being. So when people talk about anthropology, they often say it's the study of humankind. And I'm going to explain that it's a bit more complicated than that. But at heart, we're interested in what it is to be human, because we know that as a species, we are very similar to each other. All right. So around the world, biologically, we're basically all the same. But socially, we are extraordinarily different. Our societies are bound up and put together in the most extraordinarily different ways. So as anthropologists, what we're interested in is what binds our social groups together. How do we work together? How do we live together? And as fundamental, why do our societies change? Okay, so there you've got some pictures of all sorts of different people from different human backgrounds. And we are interested in why as human beings, we bond together and how that works. And as I will talk about a little bit later, okay, the impact it has on things like conflict around the world. All right. So there's really two sorts of anthropology, one of which gets taught predominantly at Queen's, the other of which doesn't. All right. The first, which some people will be more familiar with, is physical anthropology. And that looks at the evolution of the human species over long periods of time and is very closely connected to archaeology and biology. The set of skills that you have if you're a physical anthropologist are somewhat different to those of us who are social anthropologists. All right, and you tend to look at objects such as the human skull that you can see next to you, and you look at how that physical development of the human being has taken place through evolution. Now, there are connections to social anthropology, which is broadly what we study at Queen's, in that we are all interested in how human beings behave within a social group, because we are unique amongst species in the development of our social being. There's lots of species around the world that work in groups, but none of them work in groups in a way that can construct a world around us, a world that can put human beings on another moon and send things to other planets, shows a form of social development which is far and away different from anything else you'll find amongst any other species. All right, so I suppose our big question in social anthropology is, how do those societies work? All right, what are the roles that we get in? What are the power differentials between people in those social groups? And how does it change over time? How have we moved from being very small hunter-gatherer groups, basically family and lineage groups, to the sort of mass societies that we have today? And what are the problems that come about when you develop into a mass, large society? All right. So how do we live together? And we analyze that in a lot of different ways, but we're particularly interested in things like the family. So how do social groups, how does a family work within society? And the importance of the family within society is going to be very different in some societies, such as hunter-gatherer or agricultural societies, than it is in more industrial societies. So we look at the role of family. As part of that, we would look at the gendered roles in all of that, the part played by people of different gender, different sexualities in all of those societies. And we also look at the big things that glue our society together. We look at religion, we look at politics, we look at nationalism. Why is it that we all become associated with particular groups so that we can feel ourselves a part of a country, a part of millions of people that we don't know? And yet we think we have an affinity with them because we're part of the same country. So we're interested also in those big areas of group belonging. All right. And when we teach all of that, what we're interested is giving students the skills to understand that world, but also to impact and affect upon that world. All right. So I would say anthropologists are interested in some of the deepest questions about how human being worked. And to do so, we're giving real skills of critical thinking, of the relationship between different sorts of culture and how you research that. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what will you learn? What will you learn if you're doing anthropology at Queen's? Well, let's think about some of the questions. All right. What is cultural difference? All right. What is it that makes some groups of human beings appear very different from other groups of human beings, and why can that sometimes cause conflict? And in some ways, we argue that we're all not actually as different from each other as you would think. So if we take something like an institution like marriage, I'll come a bit more to that later, there are certain forms of marriage or joining together of groups of people through marriage in nearly every society in the world. But if we look cross-culturally, those forms of marriage, the way it works can work very different in different sorts of society. It raises questions of why those differences work. How are different societies adapting to the different circumstances that you're living in? It raises fundamental questions of what is it about being a human being that is natural or is biological, and what is it that is constructed as sociological? What is it that is part of the way we've developed social groups? All right. We have people that look very closely at conflict. All right. Why does conflict develop between groups? And just as importantly, how do we overcome that conflict? And there's a number of courses which I'll talk about where we look at conflict and conflict resolution among social groups. And there's really not much more important than trying to deal with that in our modern world. As I've already mentioned, we look at relationships within family, the concept of love. If you know much about history and the complex social world that we live in, you'll know that some marriages take place that are arranged. Many societies have arranged marriages where being in love is not a key part of getting married. So that tells us something about how that society works, and of course creates much tension in some modern communities. We're also very interested in the outworkings of society. Queen's almost invented a discipline actually in the 1970s called ethnomusicology, which looks at music as an outworking of our society. Why do we use music? When do we use music? How is it being used? How does it bring together? And when you're at Queen's, you can do courses in ethnomusicology, which sort of looks at the sociology of music. We also have experts looking at art and the media and looking at the role that art plays in our society. And this is very important. What I think doing anthropology does, we look around the world and we see how other societies work, but inevitably, when you learn about other societies, you also learn about your own society. You start to understand things that take place in your society by comparing it with what people do in other societies. So what are the skills you get out of that? What do you sort of do if you're an anthropologist, apart from, as in my case, go on to do anthropological research, which I'll talk about a little in a minute. Well, first of all, and I think this is the most important thing about being at a university, and whatever discipline you do, it's all about learning critical thinking. It's all about learning about how to take a problem, deconstruct that problem, take it apart, try and work it out to see if you can find solutions. Why are certain processes working? And that is a skill which will serve you in almost anywhere area you go to after universities. Any sorts of companies, businesses, governments are looking for people who can do critical thinking. So first and foremost, we hopefully give you the skills to critically analyze the world around you. We do so by offering cross-cultural understanding. So we'll start to make you think about why different cultures do it in different ways. Let me give you a very quick example of that. Let's take something very fundamental like a greeting, all right? And in our society, up until very recently, all right, the normal way that you greet somebody who you haven't met before is you shake them by the hand, all right? Now, if you travel to other countries, you will realize that that simple act, which we take for granted, of greeting is more important, is different in different places. It's not as simple as it seems. If you go to France, then you might be greeting somebody with a kiss on the cheeks, and that can vary in different parts of France. But if you go to parts of Asia, it might be a bow. In other parts, it might be a hug. Actually, something as simple as a greeting, all right, can become quite complicated. And in the last 6 months, under the COVID pandemic, I've noticed people to deal with the fact that although they're meeting, they've now got to keep a social distance. So there's an etiquette, just as on the most simplest thing like meeting. There's different cross-cultural etiquettes wherever you go around the world. And that's just a tiny example of the sort of thing that we might look at. We're teaching you to do research. We're teaching you how to take a problem and what are the methods and the mechanisms you can go around to solving that problem, all right? Probably the key thing that we do in anthropology is interviewing and participant observation. So unlike our friends and colleagues in sociology, a discipline which we share much in common with, what we do in anthropology is we do participant observation. We spend large amounts of time within the social group that we're interested in, all right, studying how people behave in their everyday situation. And as part of that, interviewing people is a very, very important method. So you'll learn a lot about living within particular groups and how to understand how that social group works. And still in this world, one of the most important things you have to do, whatever area you go into, is learn to write, is learn to explain something through the practice of writing. So writing is also a very important skill that you'll learn while you're here, and also how to make presentations. How do you get ideas across to other people? And again, those will be skills that we'll use whatever sort of a world you go into after university. So let's think about some of those worlds. Here's one example of an anthropologist who's now working at Intel. And you might say, well, why would a technology company be interested in having an anthropologist? Well, think about it. Think about how your social life has changed since we've started using computers, since we've started using smartphones. I mean, think about the tensions in your own family as you discuss the use of a smartphone, of all of those apps, whether it be Twitter or Facebook. All of this is changing our social world, and we are intensely interested in how human beings adapt to those changes. And not surprisingly, the technology companies are intensely interested in it as well. So technology companies are interested in hiring anthropologists just to get to see how their new technology is working and how best to make it work, all right? Of course, that can have negative and positive impacts. We had a student 3 years ago who did a dissertation, fantastic dissertation. She's now working for a technology company, on wait for it, people in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, who did all their work from home on their computers. So they didn't go into the workplace at all. Now think how important that issue is in our present circumstances, where lots of people will now be thinking about, what does just working at home and not going into the office mean? That is a good example of the sort of research work that an anthropologist might undertake. All right, so we've got people who end up in all sorts of places, civil service, particularly in international development. Many NGOs working around the world will be hiring anthropologists, because when you're going into new spaces, you have to deal with the cultural impacts of taking help and assistance into particular places. So we work a lot with international NGOs. Many anthropologists have become journalists. We work in conflict resolution. I can talk a little bit about that. That's my particular area. Arts, museums, lots of areas of teaching, research. So there's a really diverse amount of spaces which anthropologists end up working in. All right. So what's it like actually being here? Here's a closer picture of some of the houses that we use along University Square, which is where we're based in Queens in Belfast. As I said, you'll be taught by experts. We were 7th in the list of anthropology departments in 2020 in the Guardian University Guide. And you'll see, and I still can't quite believe these figures, but they're all statistically collected separate from what we do. But our students gave us in 2019 100% student satisfaction rate in anthropology, which is absolutely phenomenal. So in 2019 we're actually top of the league for student satisfaction. All right. We have research, as I say, world-class research from all around the world. Here's just a few of the books that myself and my colleagues have been producing over the last few years. We work across a number of global research areas: Australia, Melanesia, in the Pacific, Japan, Greece, Cyprus, Turkey. I myself, most of my research is on Ireland, the UK and Northern Ireland. So if you're coming to this part of Northern Ireland for the first time, if you come to Belfast for the first time, and you're really interested in how this place works, and Belfast, let me tell you, is a really interesting place, then I'll be teaching some of the courses to tell you about the place around us. And this is very important, you, the students, will be doing dissertations that can take you around the world as well. One of the things that we think is very important in the course is that you learn how to do research, you learn how to travel and deal with different sorts of cultural spaces. So our teaching has an emphasis on skills training so that you will learn to do a lot of those things that we're talking about. It's very much about learning how to engage with people. All right. We have placements so you can go and work in particular workspaces and research spaces. I had a student a couple of years ago who wanted to look at American identity and how it worked. And he worked for a political organization in California during an election to see how their election system works in California. And so he spent a summer with one of the political parties in the US looking at how elections work. That's a particularly interesting example. Now you're taught through a series of modules, and here is a list of the sorts of courses. They every so often we do a few changes, but this is broadly the sort of courses that you will be being taught when you're at Queen's. You broadly speaking do 6 courses every year. So in your 3 years, you do 6 in your first year, 6 in your second year, 6 in your third year. And if you're doing straight anthropology, you do have a choice every year of taking a course or so that's not in anthropology. So you can look around our school and beyond and take other courses that interest you, because being in a school of with historians, people who do politics and philosophy, their courses have lots in common with what we do. So we're very keen on our students exploring, for instance, doing a first year course on philosophy. I always recommend. But these are the courses, these are our anthropology courses. And in your first year, all right, you will be taking some introductory courses, one called Being Human, another one called World on the Move, when we are looking fundamentally what it is to be a human being, and also what it is to be a human being in a very changing world that we live in, and broadly speaking, look at globalization. All right. In the second semester, you take a course called looking at creativity in human beings. We look at what it is to actually be in a social group. Why do we become so enthusiastic to be part of social groups? All right, that's in a course that I teach called Us and Them. And I also teach on a course called Understanding Northern Ireland, which gives you a bit of background of the place that you will be in if you're not already from here. All right. And then in the second semester, you'll get a range of courses developing all of those understandings. We look obviously at things like sex and gender. We look at anthropology in business. There's a fantastic course that looks at the idea of the apocalypse around the world, which we co-teach with the historians. I teach a course, and this is an important thread that runs through the course, called Hanging Around on Street Corners, which is your first look at how to do anthropological research. And the key to all of this is that we want you to do a dissertation. We want you to do a piece of research which you learn how to do in the course that I teach in the first semester of the second year. In the second semester of the second year, you take a dissertation writing course where you learn how to do the dissertation research. In the summer, you do the dissertation, and in the first semester of your third year, we help you write that dissertation up. And that may base you in a placement with an organization, which means that you could be working on a particular topic for 18 months whilst you're at Queen's. It gives you consistency right through the course, and we'll help you with whatever area you're interested in undertaking research on. And in your final year, you take some advanced anthropological courses. And very much in your final year, we're looking that you can develop your writing skills. How do you present some of your ideas into the outside world? All right. So that opportunity to go and do field work is at the core of our anthropology degree. All right. We're interested in you going out to places, working with organizations or working with individually to understand parts of the world, the change that are taking place in our world. We've had people do amazing things around the world. I've already given you a couple of examples, but we've had people in orphanages in Kenya, looking at gun culture in Texas, women's sports in Spain, financial companies in Singapore, street food vendors in Vietnam, Irish music in County Clare, tech companies I already mentioned in San Francisco, and people working in international schools in Japan. As well as that, we have Erasmus courses, which means that you can visit and spend time in various universities around Europe and indeed around the world. So we've got lots of connections with universities around the world. I had a student in Australia a couple of years ago, spent 6 months in studying on Australia. So that's the potential. Let me give you one example of understanding other worlds. Just a quick example. All right. Let's take something like being a father, being a dad. All right, which I sort of know a little bit about myself. All right. And you could take it for granted that being a father around the world is the same sort of thing. All right. But in actual fact, you might be surprised, all right, that there are some societies in the world where you can have more than one father. All right. The idea of being a father is not just biological parenthood, but it's also social parenthood. And the nature of who is your father figure can change in different sorts of societies. Indeed, and this is controversial, but often used as an example, all right, there appears to be at least one society in the world, all right, where there doesn't appear to be any role for a father, all right, so that the women in this society take lovers, all right, and the child will grow up without knowing exactly who their biological father is. So actually, when we start looking around the world at cultural differences on parenthood, we find some really distinct differences. And what the questions we ask as anthropologists is, how is that society working? Why is it that that particular form of ways of being a mother and a father have developed in those societies? Just to give you another quick example, this is from the module Us and Them, which I teach, and is a passion of mine, understanding why we have conflict in the world. And at the core of this is why do we feel we're a part of a social group? When you're born into the world, you're born without any of those skills or senses of belonging. You're just born very quickly to into usually a small family group. But as you will know, in our society, you very quickly become part of other groups. All right, and some of these are massive social groups. You know, if you're born into the United States, you will end up part of a group which is technically over 300 million people who see themselves as American. All right. So how does that group sense of belonging develop, and what are the difficulties with it? So we look at a number of issues around what it is to make people a social group, around the identities and traditions that are created. I have a colleague who asks a very, very fundamental and interesting question about those social groups. Why are people prepared to die for their social group? So what we know is that human beings, we can sort of understand why human beings may be prepared to die or protect their family. But of course, in modern wars, human beings are prepared to die for their country, apparently prepared to die for values which are much broader than just protecting their family. How does that work? Why people prepared to put their lives at risk for other sorts of values or for other ways of being? All right. And that, of course, leads us to a question of how conflict takes place between groups, why conflict takes place between groups. And it's important to know that, because if we want to produce a more peaceful world, we've got to try and understand how that conflict works and how we move beyond conflict. So that's another module. So in doing all of this, we're very keen that people go around the world. We've got connections with universities around the world. Here are some of the ones in Europe. But as I say, we've had people studying in the US and recently people studying in Australia. And you can also do anthropology with some of the other disciplines. So you can do joint degrees with history, English, French, Irish, Spanish, politics, and philosophy. We have a lot of students that do the combination of anthropology and history. We have a very close relationship with our friends in history. And it doesn't take a genius to work out why that's true, because historians are broadly looking at the way human beings have worked through periods of time. Anthropologists are basically looking at how human beings work in the present day. So there is a very close relationship between the study of history and the study of anthropology. So also another thing to think about is often when you go to research in other places, being able to use a second language, which I'm ashamed to say I can't, which probably tells you why I'm doing my research here. Second languages is also very important. All right, so we have quite strong links with the language department as well. And if you want to get a bit of a sense of what's going on in the department, then we have a blog site. Recently, there've been lots of blogs going up on trying to understand the COVID pandemic and the difference it's made to our site. We have students and staff who are putting up articles, putting up pictures. So feel free to come and look at the blog site, our school blog site, and you'll see plenty written by anthropologists about the world that we are living in. All right, and I suppose just to end, a quick thoughts on what it's like to be at the university, what it's like to be in Belfast. Because we have lots of connections with ethnomusicology, we have lots of connections with the music department. There's all sorts of things you can take part in. There's all sorts of things performances that we develop over the years in anthropology. Queen's is a very lively place, and Belfast is a fantastically lively place. I won't go into detail now, but I arrived in Belfast when there was still significant violent conflict taking place. And I've watched this city move on in amazing ways. And to walk through the city now, it's been different in COVID, of course, the restaurants, the pubs, the theatres, the stuff going on in this city is just brilliant. And you're also in a very quick walking distance from going up to some beautiful countryside. Indeed, you can see there a picture of some of our students up on the Cave Hill in North Belfast. From my house where I'm sitting, I'm walking distance from the centre of Belfast. I could be up exactly where they're standing in about 20-25 minutes walk, and we take the kids up there very regularly. So it's also a beautiful part of the world as well. So please get in touch with us. If you want to know more about anthropology, more about being in Queens, please get in touch with me. If you're a student who's either thinking of coming here or coming here and you want to know more, I'm more than happy to talk to you on a Zoom or a FaceTime chat. You'll find the staff here are very, very helpful. We are always enthusiastic for people who are enthusiastic about anthropology. So if you have any questions, you can get in touch with the university, but please feel free to get in touch with us and having conversation. You can get our email details on the website, and we're more than happy to chat to students at whatever position you are. If you're still at school or you're working out, or indeed if you're a mature student that wants to come back and take a discipline. You know, it's fantastic to have students who have lots of life experience taking anthropology. So with that, thank you for listening. And I know that if there are any questions, please get in touch with us and we'll do our very best to answer them.